One.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective. Today I'm with Michael. How's it going, Michael?
I could be better, but I'm glad to be here.
Fair enough. So today, I believe what we're talking about is Israel's recent kind of exchanges with Egypt, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that tension. So this is coming in the context of the impending kind of operation in Rafah and the operation that we saw the other day in Rafah to do with saving the hostages, which took place. And this tension is coming basically because Rafah is pressed up right against Egypt's border with Israel. And a lot of the people who've already kind of fled the fighting in the north of Gaza have fled to the south. And so there's a huge concentration of Palestinians and people on that border, and Egypt's quite worried about what's going to happen there. So, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, Israel and Egypt were basically in a state of war from 1948 until 1978. And then Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, who was the head of Egypt at the time, at the Camp David Accords, negotiated a peace deal with the aid of then President Jimmy Carter. And Egypt now, I guess, is threatening to withdraw from that treaty if Israel goes into Rafah to root out Hamas.
Yes. And do you think there's a meaningful chance of them doing that? I mean, so one of the people that I was listening to kind of talk about this was suggesting that really what Egypt wants is for Hamas to go away, that Egypt wants to kind of get on and move past these kind of problems and doesn't really want the tension with Israel. Do you find that credible?
It's hard to tell when you're dealing with nations and intelligence, whether they're serious, they're bluffing, what they're trying to get. So I ultimately have no idea. But I definitely think that Egypt does not want Palestinians, overflowing their border. That I'm confident of, and I'm sure I don't think Egypt wants any more to do with Hamas than Israel does. The thing that this honestly, Morgan, reminds me of is the complication of war, right? Because war doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not just a matter of, okay, this is our enemy, let's go kill this enemy and be done with it. It's like the great classical liberal writer on economics, Henry Hazlitt, and of course he derived his principle from Frederick Bastiat, was the seen and the unseen, understanding the immediate consequences of an action in the long term. So yes, you can go into Rafah, you can root out Hamas, but now is that going to mean war with Egypt? I don't know. Is it worth it? I don't know. And I'm not suggesting that because Egypt is threatening this, that Israel should not go into Rafah. I'm simply stating that whenever you get involved in these type of conflicts, it's tricky because other players are involved. It's not just a matter of this is my enemy and kill them. It's a matter of a broad swath of things. And is that in Israel's interest? Can Israel fight Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas on the Gaza Strip, and then another front perhaps with Egypt if it comes to that? Now, I know a lot of people say, well, that's not going to happen. Well, maybe not, but these things have a tendency to spiral out of control in ways that you don't know are going to happen.
Excuse me, I'm still off the back end of a cough. Yes, well, and certainly I think it would be irresponsible for people to not really think about it in terms of the consequences of these kind of things. Because as you kind of say, these things can spill over in ways you don't anticipate. And Rafah really is on the border with Egypt, and Egypt really is voicing its concerns, let's say. So even if it's right for the Israelis to do this, and if the Israelis have to do this, which I think there's a reasonable case that they do, you really have to consider that there could be, consequences from Egypt, rightly or wrongly. That is something that really could happen. Um, and I mean, another thing that's popped up surrounding this is again, not just Egypt's response, but the international community, which always seems like a kind of cringy word to me, but there you
It
go.
is.
Um, who are threatening kind of further actions International Criminal Court um, if Israel goes into Rafah. Um, so I mean, one, I want to talk about that. But do you think it that Israel should go into Rafah? Um, the suggestions that we're kind of that I'm hearing about why they should do this surrounding that this is kind of the last stronghold for a lot of the Hamas leadership who have had to flee the rest of Gaza. So a lot of them are going to be concentrated in there. And then I suppose if their goal is the destruction of Hamas, it would make sense to do that. And that there's also, since they also want to save a lot of hostages, or as many as they can, that there's going to be some there. And of course, they've saved two of them already. So do you think it makes sense for them to go into Rafah, or do you think that they shouldn't be doing that?
Okay, in order to answer this question, let me bring this down to a micro level.
Okay.
When I make decisions about my own life, I try to factor in everything that I can consider, right? Is this, and my standard is myself, is this ultimately in my own best interest? Not just in the next 5 minutes, but in the next 5, 10, 20 years. Should I be behaving myself this way? That said, I think that Israel should act in its best interest over the next 5, 10, 20 years. I definitely think that means eradicating Hamas. Now, if going into Rafah is a necessary step in getting rid of Hamas, then my initial assessment would be yes, they should do it. But the intelligence services in Israel and the people making decisions in Israel have far more information than what we have, right? So when they look at that information, they should do whatever is best for them, not them as the intelligence, but best for the Israeli people. And again, if that means going in and rooting Hamas out of Rafah, then yes, they should do it.
Sorry, it seems to be every time I try and speak, it catches up to me.
That happened to me once. I was interviewing somebody during a podcast and I went into an absolute coughing fit.
Oh
And
dear.
I didn't know about mute at the time. So, so it was insane, which is why now I always bring my trusty cup of water.
I've got I'll try and cough into my coffee. Um, so I mean, also, I think why there's some tension from the international community about this is to do with the fact that there's a lot of civilians now in Rafah, and that's of course a big priority for them. So we've seen David Cameron, now Lord Cameron, who we spoke about on the show the other week, saying that Egypt really needs to think twice and so on and so forth. And when an international politician or a foreign secretary says someone should think twice, really that is containing a kind of a veiled threat, whether that's a military threat, which I don't think this is, or just the threat of sanctions or economic consequences, whatever. Um, I think that's what he's really getting at. And there was an interesting development where the UK government sanctioned West Bank settlers, which was something that we covered the United States government having done, but the UK government's now done it. And we're put into this really tricky situation where I think it's quite plausible that Israel may have to go into Rafah to do this to finish the job they've started. But increasingly, in terms of the result from the international community, I think unjustly, they're increasingly a kind of pariah state. So the more that kind of reaction comes along, the more Israel is cast in the light which actions like their action in the International Court of Justice, I think, is meant to cast them in the light of, or in the role of, which is of not a morally superior kind of Western nation. It's of a suspicious rogue actor, right? And unfortunately, I think Israel is probably going to have to weigh up in its own mind whether it really cares about that. And there's a way in which if Rafah is the right action, then they should proceed anyway. But also it's a really awful thing that they're having to weigh up the fact that they're going to be made to look like that. So I mean, what do you think about that in terms of the international community?
Well, it depends on which angle that we look at it from, right? If we're talking about the moral sanction of the international community, I mean, first of all, the international community, let's consider what this consists of. Communist China, Russia, you were ruled by basically a dictator in Vladimir Putin. Iran, governed by, religious fanatic mullahs. And So the international community, it's not as if this is made up of paragons of virtue and defenders of individual rights and liberty. You're talking about some very nasty people. And then when you examine, okay, well, what is their gripe with Israel? Well, some people view it through the lens of like a Marxist oppressor oppressed sort of dynamic where they see Israel's the stronger country. And anytime there's a weaker part of a conflict, the weaker part is always to be defended. You also have your run of the mill anti-Semitism, which I got to tell you, I've really been kind of blown away by how much of it there is. I didn't realize it. I've heard it, but much with like with cries of racism, I tend to, and I'm going to keep doing this. I give people the benefit of the doubt. Everyone that criticizes Israel isn't an anti-Semite. I think they could just be mistaken, whatever. But there are a lot of anti-Semites out there. There's people that just don't like Israel because of the Jews. So you've got your sort of conflict theorists out there who hate Israel because they're strong. You got people that hate them because they're Jews. And there's no way that Israel could ever appease those people. Israel cannot appease the Hamas or the Arab countries. They're the Arabs that hate them and think that they shouldn't exist. So what do? How do they deal with it? And but again, it's like we've been talking about, you just because these people are a bunch of scumbags doesn't mean that you necessarily want to go into a war with them, because those results might be worse than if you disengaged from them or tried something different. Poor Morgan.
I'm sorry. It hasn't been this bad in the last few days when I've been doing shows. Um no, I think you're right on you're onto something there. And my guess about this, and it may be completely wrong, or maybe the Israeli government, if it were to act on my advice, would get itself into real hot water. But my thought is that since what's happening is a lot of kind of suggestions and a lot of kind of pussyfooting about it, that the international community will probably do nothing if Israel goes into Rafah. It might be annoyed, it might say things, but in terms of military action, I suspect they won't do very much. Um, because if they were serious, so for example, if Israel, sorry, if Egypt were serious about taking military action in response, at least in terms of what I've seen, they haven't kind of stumped up and made this serious threat of saying, "Hey, if you do this, we're going to really take action against you for doing that." Um, have you? So, I mean, do you agree with that? Have you seen anything from in terms of Egypt's pronouncements?
No, I'm my guess is that they won't even withdraw from the treaty.
Hmm.
But again, I mean, these are high stakes games of poker, where
Yeah.
you think someone's bluffing and then they're not, and then you've got a real problem on your hands. And obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli intelligence agencies know stuff that we don't know. For all we know, the Egyptians behind the scenes are telling Israel, "Look, this is just a bluff. We're trying to placate, the surrounding countries and the militants within our own country." We just don't know, right? So that said, again, it always for me comes back to what is in the best interest of Israel. Not the best interest of Israel isn't what always comes back to for me. I'm saying each person and therefore each group of people should always assess what is best for them before acting. And I think that that's what Israel needs to do. And the problem for you and I in making that determination is we are far from we hardly have the adequate information in order to do so. Now, I understand that doesn't really make for a good episode when we can't say, look, they should do this, they should do that, they should go in. The bottom line is Israel, I believe, needs to destroy Hamas. Hamas is an evil organization. I think Israel, despite its flaws, and I've been the first to point out many of them, is the morally superior nation. For that, they ought to get our moral support
Mhm.
to do what is right in these cases. That doesn't mean, though, that whatever they do is right. You know what I mean, Morgan? It means that we support the broader themes. Yes, the people of Israel have a right to their country. The people of Israel have a right to eliminate the threats that want to destroy them. Those things we can absolutely get behind. When it comes to the day-to-day sort of minutia, I guess maybe the word, That's where it gets kind of tricky and difficult for me, anyways.
Mm. So yes, no, I agree with you. That it's hard to make the decision. But I think it's still worth examining through. And I think
Sure.
there's even something plausible in what you say, at least to me, about Egypt saying to Israel behind the scenes, look, we're not serious about this, because from Israel's, sorry, I keep mixing them up. From Egypt's perspective, um, Egypt can't be seen really in any way to be kind of too friendly towards Israel or too cooperative because they kind of lose face with a lot of the Arab nations surrounding them. And that's probably is motivated partly by historical grievances with Israel, but ultimately probably to do with the anti-Semitism. If Egypt was seen as just being too pally-pally and letting Israel do whatever it wants, then
Did you just
they,
say pally pally?
yeah, is that another Britishism? Yeah, pally-pally.
I love it though. Well, but you're out. The thing is, look what happened after they signed the initial peace treaty. Anwar Sadat ultimately was assassinated.
Mm,
Egypt's relations with Syria didn't get normalized, I think, until 2005. I want to say, correct. I may be wrong on the exact date, but there was blowback against Egypt, and they may not want to be seen as complicit in what Israel is doing. So, they throw out some bluster and play the game.
yeah. And as I say that you know that resistance ultimately then might be spawned by the anti-Semitism, we can focus in on that for a moment, I guess, because that's an interesting part of this, and because you said your reaction was that you didn't realize there was so much of it out there, and I think that's been my response as well, and I think a lot of people's. Um, and do you have any thoughts about how that's developed recently? Like, has it always been there and just gone underground for a few decades? Because my reaction sort of growing up was basically that anti-Semitism was a prejudice that people couldn't maintain in the modern world. Basically, it was like so discredited. It was just literally just like a few fringe loons on the edge of society, not very many people at all. And yet, although it's not exactly like acceptable in the mainstream per se. Like there are some people who get away with stuff. Um, it's much more common than it seems to have been.
It's hard for me to say, given that I was in prison most of that time, the last
Sure.
25 years up until a year ago. But in prison, I did see some of this stuff. It was mostly amongst conspiracy theorist types or black Muslims who had hostility towards Jews, and they would make ridiculous claims, the international Jewish banking conspiracy. And I used to joke with them and say, "Yeah, I get the newsletter, once a week because of my last name." But I'm not a religious Jew. My last name happens to be Liebowitz. And on Facebook, on Twitter, I've had people say, "Oh, just look at his last name. Which tribe is he from?" And he's I forget the word that they use, but just vile stuff. But I will say this: I don't like the term anti-Semitism. I use it because it's common parlance. I like anti-Jew better
Mhm.
because the Palestinians are Semites. So to say they're anti-Semites, it's just whatever. I get that that's the common parlance, but the people are really anti-Jew. Like I mentioned before, somebody accused me of trying to Jew-splain something to them. I mean, it's just vile the degree to which this stuff is out there on social media. It's crazy to me. I can't, like I said, I never thought that it was that widespread. But at the same time, I have to be careful because through the friend requests and the followers, we end up with these sort of bubbles that form on social media. And it's hard to gauge whether that's really, a representation of wider things. But even if it isn't, if it's just the people that I'm seeing, it's still a lot and it's still more than what needs to be.
Yes. I remember learning once who it was who who coined the term anti-Semitism, and he was an anti-Semite. He was sort of, I think, very proud of himself that it was a kind of 19th century German guy who loved all these dissections of various ethnic groups, right? So I guess that's why he chose the term Semitism. Um, what you said though, it reminded me of there was this kind of joke that rose up after the Second World War, where people would say, if an anti-Semite said, "Oh, look, it was the Jewish international banking class or whatever who caused the war," someone would respond, "Yes, and the bicyclists." And the anti-Semite would be then, "What, the Jews and the bicyclists? Why bicyclists?" And the person would say, "Well, why the Jews?" And the kind of point being, it's just as arbitrary as saying the bicyclists also caused it. Um, but I also think that even if you're definitely right that social media can box you into a kind of into a little group where you'll see more of certain things than is actually representative. But it's certainly also true that there's a sense in which culturally the assumption that it was unspeakable in some way. What is Daniel saying? Morgan is trying to undermine the cyclist international cabal. I am. I'm trying to point out that cyclists are the true enemy.
Are you an anti-cyclite?
Probably. Cyclists are a bit snobby, but there you go. What was the serious point that I was saying? Oh, that oh God, Daniel sends rude messages in the chat, everyone, whilst I'm trying to make a serious point. Um, that even though in social media you can get boxed into these little communities, there's a sense in which culturally that assumption that anti-Semitism was a truly unviable view to be held or something that was tolerated. Um, that's going away, and that there are people who are much more mainstream who can hold part of these opinions. It seems. I'm not saying they should, but for example, when you're seeing someone like Elon Musk come out with something kind of really stupid about Israel or so on, and yada yada yada, right? Or you see some more mainstream politicians on the left, for example, come out with things which are really kind of anti-Semitic. It's something that's really shocking, and then you see these people on the right kind of crawl out the woodwork, and it turns out they've been pretty nasty the whole time. So I think the reaction that it's shockingly more common is right, and my guess would be that it's not just that it's gone underground for the last few decades and has always been there. Although I think that's partly true. It's probably that people who, let's say in the 90s, wouldn't have been anti-Semites have become anti-Semites, if that makes sense. That they become more conspiratorial, they become more kind of open to these kind of ways of thinking, and therefore they're embracing this and feeling more confident to say these kind of things. And that, I guess, reflects a real decline in our culture. And it's partly what explains a lot of the international community's response towards Israel. It's not it solely, as we've kind of said, but I think that's there. Um, but in a sense,
Certainly.
we've wandered a bit away from the Egypt topic. Anything else to say about Egypt before we do some super chats?
No, do some super chats.
Okie dokie. So we have 3.99 from Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan. $1 from Bonnie. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And then £1 from Apollo Zeus. Thank you, Apollo Zeus. Okay, then, Jonathan. Jonathan, Michael.
Oh my Lord.
No, I'm sorry. It's just because I just read out his name. There we
No
go.
excuses. I need something in the chat from Daniel. Do we have any comments, any chats, or is that all going to come later when they put in the comment section on YouTube how you and I suck and they need to get new guys?
Yeah. So if anyone who didn't see that, the last time Michael and I did a TDO together, people didn't like it. So, um, but to be honest, when the caliber of things people were saying, there are sometimes you can explain yourself ad nauseum on a show, and people will misunderstand you no matter what, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And well, Morgan, that's actually an apt point because that's the position I believe that Israel is in, right?
Mm.
I'm a person like I'm an idiot sometimes, often. When I get into conversations with people, I expect the person to be honestly wanting to engage. So I'll get into a discussion and I'll start explaining myself and try to show them, no, that's not what I meant. But the person's not interested. They're interested in disliking me. And that I think is the position that Israel is in relation to a lot of the international community is that they want to gain acceptance by them, but they're not going to. It doesn't matter. Israel could come out tomorrow and say, look, we're going to give a two-state solution. We're going to give the Palestinians the 67 borders, and that's it. And they would still be hated because the people just want to hate them. And that's all there is to it. And when that's the case, it's an incredibly difficult and dangerous situation to be in, especially when you're Israel surrounded by enemies.
Yes, and I suppose that does link back usefully in a couple of ways. One, in that I saw someone comment on a recent video saying, look, if Israel just released all the footage and photos from October 7th, then everything would be fine. And it's things wouldn't be
No,
fine. It
no.
wouldn't work. Um, and also then in terms of Rafah, which we've been talking about, um, I guess in the sense that we're getting at that people want to be combative with Israel. People don't want to get Israel's perspective. What they really want from Israel, like, is for it to give up on the things which are in its interests, with whatever they might happen to be. So if Israel wants to gain acceptance, like you were talking about, and wants to do what's in it, it's going to have to choose at some point. So
Right. And I forgot what I was going to say. I had this great point that I was going to make, and now I forgot what it was. In relation to releasing the footage. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, when Israel doesn't release footage, then people say, "Well, look, they won't release the footage. They must not have any." If they did release footage, how many people out there would just say that it was doctored, it was edited, it was fake, it's Israeli propaganda? Because the people just don't want to like Israel. They just dislike Israel, whether it be for anti-Semitism or other reasons, whatever. And there's just no appeasing them or convincing them. And those types, Israel ought bother not even trying.
yeah. So we've got a super chat from Kirsten, which we'll go to. So we've got $14 Canadian dollars. Thank you very much, Kirsten. It says, I'm a bit late, but hasn't Egypt acted to prolong and hinder Israel's efforts since the beginning, not allowing refugees, which they could militarily manage, no action as action? Um, do you think Egypt's been hindering Israel since the beginning?
I don't think I mean, I guess you could say, well, they could accept refugees and therefore they're hindering them, but I don't think that it's Egypt's responsibility to take them. Like I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, well, if the Arab countries should take them because they're Arabs," but that just strikes me as ethnic collectivism. I'm not saying that the woman who asked that question saying that. I'm saying the other people that I've heard say it. But I don't know that it's Israel, I mean Egypt's responsibility to take refugees and to give them relief or anything else.
Yeah, I think probably the sense in which Egypt hasn't been acting positively towards Israel is that early on in the war there was kind of suggestions, like there was when Israel wasn't letting fuel and aid into Gaza, there was like a fuel truck which went missing on the border, right? And there were people who were trying to get smuggled out of Gaza in ambulances that were going back into Egypt. Um, Probably Egypt wasn't really trying very hard to stop those things from happening, would be my guess. There was probably some of that going on. But we're gonna have to wrap up just because we've got the reality show coming up. Maybe we can, if there's anything more to say for your super chat, Kirsten, since it was generous, we can get to that on the reality show. So everyone should come over and see us finish our answer to your question on the reality show, which is starting in just 2 minutes. Michael, you're on there as well, I believe.
I am, and they can catch me on my podcast, The Rational Egoist.
They very much can.
Cheap plug, but whatever.
That's what these ending bits are for. But all right, guys, we'll see you on the reality show in just 2 minutes.
All right.